Hello, and welcome to Part 1 of Chapter 2 for AP Economics Structured Independent Study. Before I begin, I would like to remind students that it is strongly recommended that they take notes on these chapter presentations. To help with that, the students can use either the prepackaged custom study guides that they can find through the course website, or the use of classic Cornell notes. Now let's begin. Chapter 2 is one of our 4 foundational chapters for our study of economics. However, many people consider Chapter 2 the most important chapter in the study of economics because of the most fundamental concepts that we cover in this chapter. This importance is reflected in the title of the chapter, and in particular through the word essence. Chapter 2 is titled The Essence of Economics. If you're not familiar with the word essence, here's a little background on it. Essence is a noun. It's the most important ingredient or crucial element. The substance or being, what is at the root. Used in another sentence, the essence of the problem was his lack of discipline. So with the word essence here being the most important ingredient, Chapter 2 holds some of the most important concepts for our study. In Part 1 of this chapter, we're going to continue our introduction to and build upon the fundamental concepts that were introduced in Chapter 1. Specifically, we're going to take an even deeper look at the methods in personal, business, and societal decision-making. We're going to introduce students to the first law of economics and life, and the 2 very important concepts of opportunity costs and marginal analysis. So let's get started. We're going to start with a great quote that will help us put into sharper perspective the ideas that we were looking at in Chapter 1. The quote is from Mark Atterbury, who wrote The Samson Syndrome. And here it is. The primary difference between man and animals is that man has the ability to act according to reason rather than just instinct. And this is particularly true with regard to the resources that we have. We saw in Chapter 1 that resources are scarce and we can't have everything, particularly for our needs and wants. We need to make smart choices with regard to everything. In taking our first big step forward here in Chapter 2, we need to help everybody understand the secret and highly valued first law of economics and life. So secret is this law that we use a code word for it, and here it is. It's pronounced Tanstaffel. Now, the truth of the matter is it's not a code word, it's an acronym. You may be familiar with that term. That's a fictitious word that's made up of first letters of other words. So you will not be able to find Tanstaffel by looking it up in the dictionary, but I am going to tell you what it means and what it stands for here in a couple of moments. Well, we have a little work to do to set up your understanding of the acronym Tanstaffel, the first law of economics and life. And in helping set that up, we're back to asking questions once again. So here's the first one. What does free mean? Well, the answer to that is it doesn't cost anyone anything. And when I share this with people, I usually get the second question that immediately follows, which goes this way. Is anything free? Now stop and think about that for a second. I'm going to give you an example to consider as well. And here it is. How about air? You would think air is free. Many people have told me that it is. Take a deep breath. Did that cost you anything? But now think a little bit deeper about that. What did you use to take the deep breath of air? You used energy. Where did you get the energy? from the food that you eat. And where did you get the food? At a grocery store. And the last time I checked, they don't give away the food at the grocery store. You had to pay for it. Now, some people may say, but there are some schools that provide free breakfast and free lunch. And how does that fit in? Well, somebody's paying for that breakfast and lunch. It's paid for by taxpayers. People, citizens, through their hard-earned dollars that go to the government, and the government provides the food to the schools for the lunches and the breakfasts. The air situation can be made more complex when you have situations like this. Pollution's been around for a long time, and when we pollute the environment, there are significant costs to us, and air winds up not being free. It costs a lot to clean that up. With now having some background on why you may want to reconsider the concept of what free means, we're now in a position to help you understand what is behind the acronym TANSTAAFL. Here's what TANSTAAFL means. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Every decision in life, personally, professionally, and as a society or citizens contributing to a society, every decision is either a payoff or a trade-off. Nothing is free. Very often when I tell people the meaning behind the acronym TANSTAAFL, I get a question which goes like this: but if nothing is free, why is the word free used in free enterprise and free market? The most important characteristics of the free market or free enterprise, which is our economic system, tells you why the word free is used. A high priority in our economic system, the free market, is placed on the freedom of choice and the opportunity to be able to make the trade-offs in decision-making. Now, you may recall that in Chapter 1 I made a couple of appeals to you as to why I believe that an understanding of rational decision-making is important to you from a personal, professional, and a citizenship perspective. Here in this chapter, I'm going to make my final appeal, now having given you a little bit more and deeper insight into decision-making, why you may want to have a better understanding of how to make good, rational decisions. And there are 4 reasons why. First, you're going to need to learn how to make good decisions regarding your personal finances. If you're not familiar with the word finances, finances is a noun, matters relating to money, expenses, savings, and investments. Used in another sentence, for the company to recover, it must get its finances, its money matters in order. The second reason why an understanding of how to make good rational decisions is important is that it's very likely that you will either work for yourself or be in a decision-making position as an employee for a small business. And you're going to need tons of knowledge and the ability to effectively make good rational decisions in those roles. And you'll also spend more time at work than anywhere else. In your cases, probably 50+ years. So, to effectively be able to handle trade-off considerations in all these situations and how to make good rational decisions is going to be critical for you. So now here in Chapter 2, we're ready to take our next or second step in the deeper look at decision making. And with regard to the rational decisions, we had better be sure that we're doing it with caution. In taking our next step towards a deeper understanding of rational decision making, we're going to look at how to effectively handle trade-offs. Now we'll start with a simple observation. Decisions exist only when we have options with value to trade off. And when you choose one of the options over the other, the option that is not chosen becomes a cost to you. In other words, the value of what you gave up to take advantage of the other option or opportunity. Having introduced the concept of the trade-off and the cost associated with it, at this point usually two questions come up, and here's the first. What about the situations where you have more than one option? Is the cost of the trade-off the combination of the value of all the options that were given up? The answer to this is no. It's the value of just the next best alternative. Using this example, if I chose option 1, but if I hadn't chosen option 1, I would have chosen option 3. Option 3 was my next best alternative. What we gave up is just the cost or the value of that alternative. In the study of economics, giving up that next best alternative is called opportunity cost. And here's a formal definition for you for opportunity cost. It's the most desirable alternative given up as a result of a decision. Now I'm going to give you 5 examples to illustrate opportunity cost. The first 3 are going to be related to personal decisions. The fourth one is going to be related to a professional type decision, and the fifth one will be a societal decision. So let's begin. With my first example, usually when I'm in the presence of students in a room, I have a canister with me that has 100 pennies in it. And to illustrate this example, I toss the pennies out on the floor and I ask the students a simple question. If you were walking down the sidewalk in town and you saw these pennies on the pavement, would you stop and pick them up? Students usually divide themselves into 2 camps. One saying that no, they wouldn't because it would take too much time, and the others saying that certainly they would because after all it is money. What we have here is a simple example of a decision with 2 options. Pick up the pennies or pass by. So what are the opportunity costs? First, let's consider the opportunity costs for the group that said that they would walk past the pennies and not pick them up. That's real clear. They would be giving up a guaranteed increase in wealth. Now what about the other group? The group that would stop and spend the time to pick up the pennies. They are giving up, from an opportunity cost standpoint, saving time. And I put another question in here. A tricky economist might ask something like this of those students. They'd say, but could your time have been better spent to generate even greater wealth? Now, with regard to examples 2 and 3, I'm going to go back to illustrations from the first chapter. And here's the first one, our decision with regard to deodorants. If you watch the supplemental video on the website, you'll know that if a guy chose to use the less expensive band deodorant, the opportunity cost could potentially be giving up social status. If he chooses to use the Axe deodorant, obviously the more expensive deodorant, he'd be giving up the opportunity to save money. And we know how important that is based upon what we've seen with the Rule of 70. Our third example goes back to the first chapter as well. It's that example of a decision made on transportation. And the same two opportunity costs apply here. Now, the first three examples were based upon personal decisions. There is one more recommendation I have for you. On the class website in the supplemental video area, there is a short opportunity cost video called Father-Daughter that illustrates yet one more example. And now we'll move on to our professional example. So far we've looked at how not handling opportunity cost and trade-off considerations can lead to some poor personal decision making. And some poor personal decision making, particularly in areas such as personal finance, can have a significant impact on one's life. With professional or business and societal decisions, the potential magnitude of an impact of poor decisions can be far greater and affect thousands more people than even in our personal decision making. To illustrate our point, we're going to use the story of General Motors. General Motors at one time was the largest and most profitable automobile manufacturer in the world. Since the 1980s, it has been very clear that the price of oil and therefore the price of gasoline would continue to rise and put greater and greater pressure on auto manufacturers to develop fuel-efficient cars that people could afford. The management team at General Motors knew this, and they also knew that their competitors were investing in the future, meaning for the day when they would have to produce and deliver the fuel-efficient vehicles that we see on the roads today. So the GM executives were left with a very simple decision, almost like a A-B or two-option decision. And that decision was to continue to milk the profits from a very profitable product line that they had been relying on for years, or giving up some of that profit to ensure the company's survival by investing in the future or new technology. Let's take a look at the opportunity cost situation that the GM executives were facing. If they had made an investment in new technology and research and development to prepare for the future, the money for that would have had to come from a number of different sources, one of which would have been from the personal fortunes that they had been building over the years through the sale of their very successful product lines, but also the personal fortunes of the union executives and the union workers. For example, the assembly line worker at a typical GM plant was making $79 per hour labor rate, and that's a loaded labor rate including benefits, which was a pretty nice piece of compensation. But the executives didn't make that investment. What they did is they put the company's survival at risk and kept their personal fortunes. And as political and economic conditions changed, they wound up in the 2009 year declaring bankruptcy, almost going completely out of business, only to be bailed out by the federal government of the United States, who is still to this day a majority stockholder of the General Motors Corporation. As a result of the GM executives and union representatives not handling the trade-off and opportunity cost considerations very well in this situation, it's had a tremendous impact on thousands of people and millions of taxpayers here in the United States. But ironically, and in some ways it's very funny that It's the executives and union representatives that have actually wound up paying the biggest price, as many of them were not able to protect those fortunes that they had built because they're no longer working at the company and were released when the company went bankrupt. And the GM situation brings to mind an old saying that applies to all aspects of life, and I think the GM executives as well as the union representatives could learn a lot from this. And here's the old saying: you must make yourself worse off in the short run. Give up a little bit of that income to make an investment in the future, to make yourself better off in the long run. Some of you athletes might be familiar with this old saying in a different format. If you've ever heard the old expression, no pain, no gain. This is the business version of that old saying. And now we move on to our society decision-making example. And this example is absolutely fascinating because it is the exact same set of conditions that we just looked at with regard to the GM decision-making. For the past 70 years, our nation's leaders have clearly understood the enormous risks for our country of continuing to depend heavily on oil as our primary energy source. The other option has been for quite some time to invest in other technologies that will provide us new energy sources, such as wind, nuclear, and solar, or a combination of these. Now, this decision has not been completely played out yet by our national leaders. However, over the past 70 years, they have had an ample number of opportunities to have made the significant development investments in alternative energy resources. They have chosen not to do so because they feel that if they had made the investment, they would have possibly been putting their power and personal fortunes at risk. Many of our leaders' power and personal fortunes are tied to the support of the oil industry, and the oil industry would not have looked favorably upon those investments in alternative energy sources. As a result of not having made the investment, our national security and standard of living have been at continued risk. We have seen this based upon multiple cases, the latest of which is our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. This risk is also documented clearly in the Student Choice video series under Natural Resources and the Oil Package. And also, this risk is illustrated by one other point that I'll make here. Over the past decade, the country of Iran has been in the news almost monthly, and that's because it has been developing its own nuclear weapons, and the nations of the Western world have been punishing Iran economically and politically for that. So why should we care? Well, regularly the leaders of Iran say that they will, and they use this word explicitly, exterminate Western countries such as Israel, the United States, and most of the countries of Western Europe. Iran is also the third largest producer of oil in the world, and their contribution is critical to global oil supplies. So here we have the president of Iran, who is one of the people that continually makes these threats to the Western countries. So I have this question for you. How confident are you that this guy is making rational decisions? And if it's about the same as we were from a confidence level about these particular individuals, we have a lot to think of based upon our dependency of oil. And here's the reason why. Once Iran has finished its nuclear weapons development, and they are very, very close to this, they will have put themselves in a position of significant strength. Because whether they would ever decide to use this weapon or simply turn off the oil, the results for us will be the same, in that our national security and standard of living will have been put at grave risk. And the opportunity cost of not having invested in alternative energy sources up to this point will become crystal clear. Okay, by now hopefully you have a pretty good understanding of the concept of opportunity cost. And it's time to move on in our analysis of decision making to step 3 in this chapter. And in starting with step 3, we're going to pose yet another question. So here we go. Okay, but what advice can we have offered about the situations where you have more than one option and it's really difficult to choose the best option? In these cases, we use our economic intelligence and education to perform something that we call marginal analysis. Now, you probably have never heard that term before, marginal analysis. So let me give you a definition for it and also talk about some other marginal terms. It's through the use of marginal analysis in decision making that we figure out what and how much to trade off when making decisions. Now, I'm also going to give you a couple of other important marginal terms and concepts to consider. Here's the first. I'm going to take the word marginal itself, and here's the definition for it. It's the incremental change in some economic variable, and this change can be either positive or negative. If you're not familiar with the word incremental, it's a noun, an increase or decrease in number, size, or extent, a small positive or negative change in some variable over a specific time. Used in another sentence, the scientists observed an incremental difference in fuel usage. Now let me also give you an example of a marginal measurement here in almost real practice. Let's say we have a manufacturing company producing some kind of product. And they produce this product out of their manufacturing facility. So let's say the business was created yesterday and today is their first day of manufacturing the product. And the output, in other words, how many of the product were manufactured in the first day was 2. But then in day 2, the manufacturing firm was able to produce 4 of the product. The incremental change in production of the product from day 1 to day 2 was 2. If we continue through with the example, let's say in day 3 the company was able to produce 7 of the product. The incremental difference from day 2 to day 3 was 3, or the marginal difference was 3. And then continuing from day 3 to day 4, the marginal or incremental difference was 5. So here's a question for you I like to call it the $64 million question, to keep in mind for later on, not right now. And that question is, what could help make this type of incremental or marginal production change happen? I will come back to that later. Here's a second term, marginal benefits. Net positives that occur after investing in some course of action. If you're not familiar with the word net as it's used here, it means what remains after all deductions or considerations or adjustments. In other words, the final result. Notice in the related column here I have the bottom line. Here it's used in another sentence. The net of the situation, in other words, what remained, was that the company had no choice but to shut down. Here's our next marginal term and concept. It's called marginal utility. It means how much satisfaction do you get out of the marginal benefit I mentioned a moment ago. If you're not familiar with the word utility as it's used here, it's a noun. It means usefulness or satisfaction. Fitness and relevance are synonyms. Used in another sentence, the utility of a Swiss Army knife cannot be underestimated. I'm now going to tell you a quick story that will help to bring together the concepts of marginal benefits and utility and illustrate them for you. It's a favorite of students. It's called The Case of the Glazed Donuts. And the question we have for the students who purchase these donuts with the thought of deriving great marginal benefits out of them is, how many could you eat? So let me introduce you to Derek. He's one of the people that contributed to buying the donuts. And Derek's your typical high school student. And just like many of you who probably said that you could eat all the donuts, Derek said the same. So here's Derek picking up the first donut, and the thoughts going through his mind is not surprising that this is going to taste great. So here's our question. What is the marginal utility of the first donut? Is it high or low? Now remember, utility means satisfaction, and I think the answer is obvious. The marginal utility of this first donut is going to be pretty high. So here now is Derek with the fourth donut, and he still says it tastes good, but was the marginal utility of the fourth donut the same as the first? Remember, we're talking about satisfaction here. And I think you would probably venture the guess that it wasn't as satisfying as the first. Well, here's Derek with the eighth donut, and the expression on his face says just about everything, as he's thinking maybe he can't eat all 12 of the donuts in the box. So what's the utility of the eighth donut when compared to the first? And I think you start to see the trend here. It's certainly not as satisfying. And here we have the remaining four donuts. While they still provide marginal benefits and that they could provide nourishment, what do you think the marginal utility of the last four donuts are, particularly to Derek? Do they even have any marginal utility at all? For Derek, those last four donuts don't have much marginal utility at all. But hey, he made the big commitment to eat them all. So we made him make good on that, and I think you can see that he wasn't very happy in doing so. Hey, it's time to introduce you to our first graph in our study of economics. And please don't panic about graphs. We handle graphs in economics very different than in some of the math classes that you've been in the sense that we use graphs to illustrate concepts and pictures. We don't actually do calculations of equations and then plot curves on graphs. We use graphs solely for the purpose of painting a picture. It's kind of like a picture's worth 1,000 words. And with regard to graphs, we only use the upper right-hand quadrants of graphs, meaning the positive sectors here. So let me begin, and what we're going to do is graphically illustrate marginal utility, the concept that we just looked at. So here we have an x and y axes. And as you can see, I mentioned about only using the right upper quadrant of our graph here, so we're in positive numbers. And proceeding from the intersection point of the two axes, going up the y-axis, we're increasing in numbers, and similarly going out to the right on the x-axis, the same thing, will have an increase in number. So going in graphing marginal utility, we're going to label the y-axis to paint our picture as measuring satisfaction, and along the x-axis the number of donuts in the prior illustration. And this curve that we put in, which is a very simple straight line curve on the graph, really gives a fairly clear and accurate description of what Derek was experiencing with the box of donuts. Notice that the first donut had a very high satisfaction level or a high marginal utility, and the last, or the 12th donut, certainly had a much lower satisfaction level or a lower marginal utility. Now, I have two questions for you that I'd like to throw out that we can discuss when we meet in the Resource Center, and also to plant the seed with you for some future analysis that we will do. So here's the first question. What if this wasn't donuts that we were measuring the utility for, but was water? Would the same idea hold true? And here's the second question for you to think about. Is there a relationship between satisfaction and a willingness to pay for something? Use the water example in this consideration. The next thing I'd like to do is to take you through actually how to conduct a marginal analysis when making a decision. But before I do, I have to give you a couple of clarifications about the concept of costs. So here we go. First, benefits or costs, and let me stop there for a second and remind you that if you not take advantage of a benefit and you give up taking advantage of it, it becomes a cost to you. So that's why I have benefits and costs here. Benefits or costs that are hypothetical are called in decision making implicit costs. And implicit costs should always be given less weight in making a decision. Now, if you're not familiar with the words hypothetical and implicit, I'll give you some further background here on that. Let's start with hypothetical. It's an adjective. Assumption based upon or pertaining to conditions or guesses, not facts. Conjecture or guess, as words are synonyms. She based her decision on hypothetical considerations, not facts. For implicit, it's also an adjective, implied or assumed, not specifically stated or shown, and therefore not guaranteed. Assumed or guess are synonyms, suggested, inferred are related words. She based her decision on having an implicit understanding and was disappointed when she found out what the facts were. A great example to use to understand implicit cost, we could go back to that deodorant example we've looked at a couple of times. And you might recall that one of the benefits, or the prime benefit possibly, of using the Axe product was social benefits. But the question I have for you, was there any guarantee that the guy that used the Axe would receive the perceived social benefits? And we all know the answer to that is no. There's no guarantee. So spending the $5 extra for that would be based upon implicit costs or implicit benefits. The next concept I'd like to clear up or clarify here is the opposite side of the implicit cost, which are explicit costs or explicit benefits. These are real, tangible costs or tangible benefits. In the business world, many times these are called accounting costs. They're real, hard dollar type costs that can be clearly identified. And explicit costs in decision making should always be given more weight in a decision. If you're not familiar with the word explicit, it also is an adjective, means clearly defined, expressed, or actually shown, displayed and spelled out. He solved the problem by explicitly working the equation based on the guidelines that were presented. Tangible. It's also an adjective capable of being touched and treated as fact, meaning it's real, concrete, physical, palatable. He wanted to see tangible evidence before making up his mind. And here's the last cost concept that we need to give you some deeper information on. It's the concept of sunk costs. And here's what sunk costs are. Costs that have already been incurred in the past that you can't change or recoup or gather back. And therefore, these costs should be irrelevant or meaningless in a present or future economic decisions. One of the best ways to summarize a very simple thought about sunk costs, I'm sure you have all heard the expression at some time in your life when somebody has said to you, "Don't cry over spilt milk." What they're talking about is really sunk costs. There's nothing that you can do about it. You need to move on from there. And speaking about moving on, we're now ready to do or conduct a sample marginal analysis. So let's proceed. When conducting marginal analysis during a decision-making process, we like to say that you need to be thinking at the margin or thinking marginally. And here's what this means. It means measuring the costs and the benefits of the decision options that you have in front of you. And the way to do this is by adding or subtracting variables. Now, thinking at the margin or thinking marginally also goes by another name. It's called weighing your options. And somebody may have said that to you at some point in your life when you're faced with a decision to make. You need to weigh your options. Now, before we get into the actual first example that we're going to look at here in conducting a marginal analysis, I want to make sure I recommend to the students that they go to the course website in the supplemental video area for Chapter 2, Part 1. And at this point, you may want to review, strongly recommended, review 2 videos that are listed there. One that is titled Thinking at the Margin, and the other is Economics on One Foot. And that one is a nice summary of where we've gotten to at this point in using the concept of opportunity cost. So I highly recommend that you review those videos. Now let's move on to our example. We're going to use a fun but very important example to illustrate how to conduct a marginal analysis. The fun part is that I'm going to be using one of my favorite characters in this example, this guy, Party Pete. Now here's our situation. Pete has an economics exam on a Monday morning, and this is Pete on a Friday evening prior to. Pete has a decision to make with regard to his weekend to either party or study for the upcoming exam. And we're going to use marginal analysis to figure out what Pete's opportunity costs are. Hey, but before we begin, I'd like to point one other thing out too. Some people have said to me that, gee, it's not about partying that could potentially get in the way. Could be my part-time job that I have to work all weekend and still try to figure out how much time I should invest in studying for upcoming exams. Well, you'll find that the decision-making here is the same for either situation. So let's begin. The first thing that we want to do to begin conducting our marginal analysis is to set out and consider the extremes of the opportunity cost, meaning the outer limits or bounds to it. So in Pete's case, the one extreme from an opportunity cost standpoint is social acceptance and fun, meaning that if he parties all weekend, he might be looked at as a fun guy and be very broadly socially accepted, and that's a benefit. Remember that benefits can turn into costs, the opposite side of not choosing that benefit. So if Pete decided to study all weekend, maybe he wouldn't be looked upon as a fun guy, might even be looked upon as a loser, and then that could potentially become a cost to him. Naturally, the other side of it is if you study, the likelihood that you're going to perform well on an exam is much better. And if you perform well on an exam, you run a better shot at getting into a college or a university. And if you get yourself educated and get a college degree, the statistics show, and we took a look at this in the first chapter, that your earnings potential significantly increases. So one cost of giving up one benefit of giving up the partying all weekend could be increased earnings potential. Obviously, partying all weekend while being socially accepted may wind up resulting in limiting your earnings potential. But these are the extremes. Is there anything in between? Now, you're all very smart, and I'm sure you know that the answer to that question is yes, because Pete has an entire weekend here to prepare for his exam. So he really has these four options in front of him. All study for the entire weekend, study for 2 days, study for one, or party the whole time. And obviously on the ones in between, he could spend part of his time partying. So how do we conduct a marginal analysis for Pete? Well, here's our first step. It's the first question. The first question we have to ask ourselves, going back to, and now you'll see why we further define some concepts on costs for you. We have to go back and ask ourselves the question, do any implicit costs possibly lessen the value of an option? And remember, implicit costs mean, or benefits, mean that things that aren't guaranteed, okay? And the answer to this is yes. The all-party alternative, or decision, for the entire weekend, the benefit there, or the cost, is the social acceptance, and that's not necessarily guaranteed. You could still study all weekend and be socially accepted. There's no guarantee of that benefit or cost. The second question we need to ask is, do any explicit, tangible, hard dollar, proven statistical costs or benefits strengthen or weaken an option? And the answer to that is yes, there is one that strengthens one of the options, and that's studying. Because if you do, it's likely that you will perform better on an exam. And if you perform better on your exams, it's more likely you'll be able to get into college or university of your choice, and therefore improve your earnings potential. In our marginal analysis, there is also a third question, and some people like to call this the payoff question. The third question is, how much marginal utility or satisfaction do we or would we get from each option? And here's a simple potential illustration to help us evaluate the satisfaction that we may get from each. But here's an actual better third question to ask, or maybe even a fourth. What is the marginal cost of Pete's decisions? Marginal cost is defined as the additional cost or benefit of producing or not producing an additional unit. Now, here we have the four options in front of Pete again. If Pete were to choose study 1 day, he would certainly improve his chances of graduating high school with a diploma. And the statistics show that that would better him by approximately $11,000 per year worth of income by having the high school diploma over not having one. If Pete studied 2 days, maybe he might be able to qualify himself to go to a junior college or a trade school of some sort. And the statistics here show that by developing some specific skill or getting an associate's degree, he can better his position in annual earnings by a factor of approximately $19,000. But if Pete studied all weekend, got the grades, was able to pull off going to a 4-year university, got his undergraduate and graduate degree, he could tack on yet another $17,000 on average, $17,000 a year differential over his other options by spending the time studying and qualifying himself for the higher education. So here we've looked at marginal costs, the actual costs and benefits of producing the options for the long term. So in our marginal analysis example, we've brought together the fundamental concept of opportunity cost and have added in a look at marginal utility and benefits as well. Here's our summary. You know, all party will probably wind up with little success for somebody like Party Pete, and well, that could wind up turning somebody into, well, I think you get it. But the other side of the coin is that all study can certainly lead to little fun and limitations in life. What you want to try to strive for is the right mix, which will lead to success and happiness. Having completed our marginal analysis example, it's now time to introduce you to your second graph here in our study of economics. And remember, no need to panic. Graphs in economics are pretty simple. We use them to illustrate concepts or to paint pictures. And with this graph, we're going to use it to illustrate Party Pete's trade-off options as they relate to the resources that he had available to him. And in Pete's case, there was only one. It was time. He could use time for either study or for partying. And the graph that we're going to introduce you to is called the production possibilities curve. Sometimes you'll see this referred to also as the production possibilities frontier. So here's our graph. We have our X and Y axes, and we only deal in the positive upper right-hand quadrant here. Our Y-axis is labeled as study as an option, and the X-axis labeled as party, reflecting Pete's two choices. The curve, which is a straight line curve again, represents the resources or the time that is available to Pete. And here would be an example of two possible choices for Pete utilizing the time available. Obviously, with the blue dot, if he spends more time studying, there's less time for him to spend partying, and vice versa with the pink dot as it's illustrated here. Now, here's something to consider. We're only dealing with one resource, and that's time. And here we have a point represented by the red dot. It's a point of production, and Pete could either produce one of two things, either produce study or produce partying. It's a production point that is not possible because it's beyond the time that he has available. The only way this could be achieved is to make more resources, time in this case, available. And you might be wondering, how might that occur, or would it be even possible, since there are only 24 hours in a day? Well, the reality is it can be made possible if something like this happened. If, let's say, on Friday evening or Saturday, Pete got a text message from his professor or teacher that said the exam date was moved from Monday to Wednesday of the upcoming week. That effectively expanded Pete's time frames and increased the resources that he would have available. So that would be an example of how we could actually reach that type of production point. Now, a couple of other words here about important words about this this curve, this straight line curve. It's a straight line curve that illustrates an opportunity cost, a trade-off of one thing against the other, the study against the party, regarding resources, in this case time, that the trade-off is constant, that there's an equal substitution. Now, not all decisions that involve resources can be represented with straight line curves. And the reason for that is that sometimes a number of different types of resources are involved in decision making, and the resources do not have equal substitution rates or trade-offs when you're deciding what to do. And we'll show you how that actually gets represented in a similar type of curve and graph here in a moment. We use a production possibilities curve to help us illustrate the trade-offs and decisions that businesses make and societies as well. However, the production possibilities curve looks a little different in these cases because there are more resources that can have an impact on producing something. So let's take a look at an example. And we'll consider a business example here first and then a society example. And the business example would be to consider a moving company. And we'll work with a simple example or decision facing a moving company. And that decision would be, for example, to either move boxes or pianos. What's involved in moving those two different types of things is pretty involved. It's a lot easier to move boxes than it is pianos. It takes a different type of labor to move pianos and also different types of equipment. Now you'll see our production possibilities curve here is represented as a bowed line or bowed curve. And this will help us to illustrate uneven trade-off of resources. But still, the curve represents all the resources that are available to the moving company in this case to utilize. And they have choices to make that can be reflected as you see here on the curve. Now, I mentioned uneven trade-off of resources, and that's why we use the bowed curve. Here we show how that works. It's because pianos are far more complex to move. You can see that as we move towards moving more pianos, we have a greater trade-off of labor resources, equipment resources to get the job done, and that's reflected appropriately by the curve. Producing different outputs requires uneven trade-offs of resources, and that produces an increasing opportunity cost between the outputs. Similarly, as we asked with Pete, with the point outside of the resource curve, how do we get this to the same type of situation or result with the moving company? Well, the only way, just like with Pete's situation, in a business situation here, is we need to increase our resources. Applied here, it could be either an increase in tools or a combination of increase of tools and labor to be able to get the job done. And now we'll take a look at using the production possibilities curve illustration and applying it to a societal decision-making example. And in doing so, we're going to introduce you to a couple of new terms as well. Societies have a decision to make to produce either capital goods or consumer goods. Now, these are the two new terms for you we haven't discussed here yet, so let's define them for you. Capital goods are physical capital used to make consumer goods. Examples of capital goods are things like machines, buildings, software, tools, networks, and the like. Consumer goods are short-term and perishable goods. Some examples of consumer goods are food, clothing, chemicals, light bulbs, and other things that have a relatively short life. Now, in producing capital goods or consumer goods, we again use a Bode curve because a lot goes into producing either the capital goods or the consumer goods. And here we show 2 points on our resource curve. Remember that the curve represents utilizing all the resources that we have. For example, in this case, with the society, it's the factors of production, all the resources, the land, the labor, the capital. And a society can be in one of two places, either producing more capital goods or producing more consumer goods, but to do either of the two, they have to give up some of the other. Like we've seen in the prior two examples, if you want to reach a point as a society beyond where you may be at currently and expand production of either capital goods and consumer goods both at the same time, you need more resources to be available. And in this case, what kind of resources are we talking about? It relates back to the factors of production. An example would be an increase in population, or maybe some new technology that's invented which relates to physical capital. Now I'm going to introduce you to a new point on the graph, and we'll talk about that a little bit further here in a couple minutes as well. And that's this point represented by the black dot and the curve to the left of the original curve. This point represents an underutilization where we have reduced output due to an actual loss of resources from our original position. And here's a question for you: how could this happen? And that's what we'll take a look at next. To quickly illustrate how a society can actually lose resources, I'm going to use a true example from history to illustrate the point. Let's take Japan in 1941. What consumption goods was Japan producing at that point in time in history? I'll use one as an example: rice. And what capital goods was Japan producing? Certainly military goods, as they were preparing for war, which they started with the United States on December 7th in 1941. Now, I would imagine you will have no trouble recalling from your United States history class and your world history class what the United States did in retaliation in 1945. The United States used the nuclear weapon for the first time and effectively brought the war to an end. The United States also destroyed a large portion of Japan's productive capacity. A little more specifically, what do you think happened to Japan's productive labor force? I think the picture speaks for itself. How about the quality and quantity of Japan's natural resources, capital stock, health and education, and technology? And again, I think the picture speaks for itself. So if we go back to our production possibilities curve and ask what happened to Japan's, I think it's pretty understandable at this point that their resources were significantly reduced. So now, having looked at a couple of production possibilities curve illustrations, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and also look at the importance of the factors of production and the impact that they have on a society's production possibilities curve. And in doing so, we're going to tie together a couple of the illustrations that we've looked at. And as you can see here on the left side of the screen, I have the Party Pete illustration in front of us with the decision over studying or partying. And there's a lesson to be learned in this. Education that's derived through studying produces human and physical capital and leads to growth in a society. Partying produces little to no capital and will result in no growth within a society. Now, it's that education that drives human capital and physical capital and the growth that allows us, or a society, to produce the highly productive capital goods. And great countries produce capital goods. And you'll find throughout the world that the less developed countries are the ones that can only produce consumption goods. And as a country produces more capital goods, its capital stock is increased, and its production possibilities curve shifts out faster because new technologies are developed that allows more production of consumer goods. So in summary, there are two variables that will shift the production possibilities curve outward. In other words, help the society create growth. And here they are. The first is an increase in the productive labor force, which will increase the society's productivity, the ability to produce more capital as well as consumer goods. The second is an increase in the quantity and quality of three things. First, natural resources. Second, capital, health, and education. And third, technology. Now this wraps up our look at opportunity cost and a lot of other topics covered here in Chapter 2. As we conclude, I would like to recommend that students follow up with the supplemental videos that they can find on the course website. In the Chapter 2 Part 1 section, towards the end, there are two videos there that give great illustrations of the concepts behind opportunity cost and the production possibilities curve. They are the videos presented by my friend Dr. Holden. I highly and strongly recommend students to view those videos now with the end of the second chapter. From here, we will move on to Part 2 of Chapter 2.